Have you ever wondered what would happen if the greatest moments in American history were ruined, not by war, politics, or destiny, but by the kind of petty arguments that Larry David has spent decades obsessing over? What if Paul Revere's legendary midnight ride turned into a fight over bad communication? What if the Battle of the Alamo was decided because someone couldn't stop worrying about another man's hairstyle? And what if humanity's first trip to the moon became less about history and more about who forgot to buy thank you gifts? It sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly why Life, Larry, and the Pursuit of Unhappiness work so well. Episode 6 doesn't ask whether these famous events really happened this way. Instead, it asks a much funnier question. What if history's greatest heroes were just as insecure, stubborn, and socially awkward as the rest of us? And honestly, after watching this episode, you might never look at these historical icons the same way again. One thing separates Larry David from almost every other comedy writer. He doesn't look for big jokes. He looks for tiny annoyances, the kind that most people ignore. Someone cuts in line. Someone sits in your seat. Someone doesn't say thank you. Someone borrows something and never gives it back. Most people move on. Larry David never does. Instead, he imagines those tiny social crimes spiraling completely out of control. That's exactly what this HBO limited series is built around. Each episode takes a major event from American history and quietly asks, what if everything happened because of something unbelievably trivial? By episode 6, the show has fully embraced that idea. The result is one of the funniest and smartest episodes of the season. Because every sketch follows the same pattern. History says one thing happened. Larry David says, sure, but what was everyone arguing about 5 minutes before? That single question transforms famous heroes into ordinary people. Not evil people, not incompetent people, just painfully human people. And that's where the comedy begins. The episode opens in April 1775. The American colonies stand on the edge of revolution. British troops are preparing to march. Everything feels serious. Everything feels historic. Samuel L. Jackson narrates the moment with the kind of weight you'd expect from a documentary. For a brief second, it feels like we're about to witness one of the most important nights in American history. Then Larry David walks into the story, and suddenly, everything changes. Instead of focusing on the British Army, the episode introduces an ordinary colonial couple whose biggest concern isn't survival, it's packing. The moment Paul Revere delivers his famous warning, panic erupts inside the house. Not because people are afraid, because nobody can decide what to take. One person wants food. Another insists on bringing sentimental belongings. Someone remembers eggs. Someone else argues about vegetables. Even a portrait of a deceased family member somehow becomes part of the debate. At first, the scene feels completely ridiculous, but then you realize something. Haven't we all done this? Think about every emergency you've ever experienced. Moving house, catching a flight, leaving during bad weather. Someone always stops everything to argue over something completely unimportant. Larry David understands that human nature doesn't disappear just because history is happening. In fact, history probably makes those arguments even worse. It's us. Then comes one of the episode's funniest moments. Paul Revere rides back, looking slightly embarrassed. Turns out, the British aren't actually coming. At least, not yet. That's when Larry's character explodes. He's not angry that the warning was wrong. He's angry because of the wording. According to him, Revere shouldn't have confidently announced that the British were coming. He should have said they might be coming. It's such a tiny difference. One single word, but Larry David builds an entire comedy routine around it. And underneath the joke is something surprisingly modern. Today we argue constantly about headlines, about wording, about disclaimers, about who said what, and how they said it. Episode 6 quietly suggests that maybe people have always been like that, even on the eve of the American Revolution. This is where the series becomes much smarter than it first appears. It isn't making fun of Paul Revere. It isn't mocking American history. It's poking fun at the way ordinary people behave inside extraordinary moments. Most historical dramas show perfect speeches, perfect bravery, perfect timing. Larry David shows people interrupting each other, complaining, overthinking, and accidentally making everything worse. That's why these sketches feel strangely believable despite being completely absurd, because while the events are fictionalized, the behavior feels real. By the time the first sketch ends, you begin noticing a pattern. Every historical legend starts with greatness. Larry David immediately shrinks it down to everyday life. A revolution becomes an argument over communication. A national emergency becomes domestic chaos. Heroic urgency becomes family bickering. It's almost as if Larry is saying, history isn't made by superheroes. It's made by ordinary people carrying all of their insecurities into extraordinary situations. And if that's true, What happens when those insecurities follow soldiers onto a battlefield? Because that's exactly where episode 6 goes next. The next sketch takes us to one of America's most legendary last stands, the Battle of the Alamo. But trust me, no one expects what Larry David decides is the most important part of that battle. And once you see it, you'll never look at Davy Crockett the same way again. The episode wastes no time jumping from the American Revolution to another legendary moment, the Battle of the Alamo. History remembers Davy Crockett as a fearless frontiersman who stood his ground against overwhelming odds. Larry David remembers something else, his hat. More specifically, what's underneath it. As military leaders discuss battle plans, Larry's character can't stop asking one question. Why won't Crockett take off that coonskin cap? At first, everyone ignores him, but the more he asks, the more suspicious everyone becomes. Eventually, the truth comes out. Crockett is bald. In any normal historical drama, that revelation wouldn't matter. In Larry David's world, it changes everything. The cap isn't just clothing anymore. It's branding, it's image, it's ego. When Crockett loses the cap during battle, the enemy laughs, his confidence takes a hit, and one of history's greatest heroes is reduced to worrying about his appearance instead of the war. It's hilarious because the joke isn't really about baldness. It's about how even legends care what other people think. But the episode isn't finished exposing human insecurity. Next, we jump to Susan B. Anthony and the fight for women's rights. Instead of debating equality, the sketch introduces the world's most annoying dinner guest. He calls Susan Susie, criticizes the meal, ignores basic manners, and casually argues that maybe not every woman deserves the right to vote. Every sentence makes the room more uncomfortable. Finally, Susan asks him to leave. His response? Let's vote on it. When every woman votes against him, he immediately refuses to accept a result because he doesn't recognize women's votes. It's classic Larry David, a man who loves democracy only when democracy agrees with him. The sketch perfectly captures hypocrisy in the funniest possible way. And just when you think the episode has reached its peak, it heads to the moon. July 20, 1969, one of humanity's greatest achievements. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are moments away from becoming the first humans to walk on the moon. Samuel L. Jackson gives the mission the epic introduction it deserves. The journey, the danger, the historic significance. Then Larry David immediately brings everyone back to Earth. Armstrong casually mentions he bought thank you gifts for the launch crew. Buzz didn't. Now he's embarrassed. Instead of preparing for history, the astronauts argue over gift etiquette, moon rocks, and who deserves more credit. Then comes the biggest twist. Armstrong reveals he has already prepared something to say after taking the first step. Buzz instantly realizes two painful truths. He's not taking the first step, and history will remember Armstrong's words forever. Suddenly, the greatest mission in human history becomes the world's most awkward workplace rivalry. The closer they get to the moon, the more personal the arguments become. And that's exactly what Larry David wants us to notice. Even extraordinary people carry ordinary insecurities. Finally, Apollo 11 lands. Neil Armstrong steps onto the lunar surface. He delivers the iconic line that history will never forget. Buzz follows behind, but instead of celebrating, he's still frustrated. He believes he deserved the first step. He thinks his speech would have been better. Even his greatest achievement feels overshadowed. Larry David's final joke is brilliant because it completely flips the way we think about history. We usually imagine historical figures as fearless heroes. Episode 6 reminds us they were still human. They wanted recognition, they wanted respect, they wanted to be remembered. Throughout the episode, every sketch tells the same story. Paul Revere wants to be believed. Davy Crockett wants to protect his image. The dinner guest wants control. Buzz Aldrin wants history to remember him first. Different centuries, different people. Exactly the same human behavior. That's what makes episode 6 one of the smartest entries in the series. It isn't laughing at history. It's laughing at the small, petty, and deeply human flaws that never change, no matter the century, the battlefield, or even the planet. And maybe that's Larry David's biggest point of all. You can change the world, but you can never completely escape your own ego.